We are very, very fortunate to have this guest speaker here today. I like to think that if Herman Wouk and Samuel Eliot Morison had a love child, it would be Jim Hornfischer. I think he's authored several books about the Navy, Ship of Ghosts, Neptune's Inferno, and of course what I think most of us in the surface Navy at least consider his magnum opus, The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors. And now has a new book out, Fleet at Flood Tide, and I think we're all very, very eager to hear about that. But just wanted to introduce just a great friend of the Navy, Jim Hornfischer.
I'm not sure what set me back harder, the awe of that comparison to those two names or the idea of the love child. Anyway, thanks for being here. I feel like I'm in distinguished, excellent, sympathetic company, and there's no audience I'd rather have than a bunch of Navy men to talk about the greatest chapter in naval history, the Pacific War. This is my fourth book. Each book has been a progression in scope and ambition, from the battle narrative to the ship's history to the campaign narrative that was Neptune's Inferno, and now Fleet at Flood Tide. Its origins were as a campaign history, but it really became something a little larger than that. It becomes really a reckoning with the entire endgame of the Pacific War. The campaign, of course, is the Marianas campaign. I had a colleague who was a specialist in World War I and ground operations kind of blithely tell me once that the Pacific War was over once we had the Marianas. And I remember, and we didn't have time to talk about it, but the thought stayed with me, and I thought, well, what about Iwo Jima, Peleliu, Okinawa, all that mess, the Southwest, wrapping up the Southwest Pacific? Surely he's just ill-informed. And there's this idea that I've always had of the casualty rates escalating as we march across the Pacific. I throw up a map here. Central Pacific Offensive begins with the seizure of Tarawa in November of '43, jumps north into the Marshalls, and carries west all the way to the Ryukyus. And the casualties as we go west get progressively worse, and I always thought that the casualty figures were a proxy for the importance of these campaigns, because naturally we're getting deeper into enemy territory, closer to the enemy stronghold and citadel. And so then Okinawa would have to be the most important campaign strategically as well. This was kind of the assumption I had as I did my reading, I guess, and formed my notions of this epic war. But the Marianas were really the fulcrum. The Marianas were just inside that dotted line, if you can see it here, kind of an eye chart, I apologize, but we've got this dotted line running right here. The Japanese National Defense Zone, established in June 1943. This comes off of Japanese documents. This was their inner perimeter. This was the outer edge of their perimeter, if you will. With the thrust into the Marianas, landings on Saipan on June 15th, this is what triggers the largest sortie of the combined fleet, kind of the total effort to repel the American advance across the Pacific. Of course, they're dealing with MacArthur as well, but at the same time as advancing on Biak right there. So we have simultaneous entries into this Japanese National Self-Defense Zone, and it triggers calamitous military operations and this campaign on air, land, and sea that was bloody in every respect. So what I wanted to do in this book was to kind of fold it all into one volume, to include naval operations, the fight for Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, and make sense of the strategic air campaign that unfolded after those islands were secure. And so in that sense, the book is focused on air, land, and sea, although it is naval history. But the subtitle of the book refers to total war. It'll be my thesis that the nature of the whole fight in the theater changed once we set boots and conquered Saipan. A couple things happened there that I'll make the case were very significant. Strategically, we put ourselves in a position to do a lot of things from that position in the Central Pacific. But in terms of our perception of the enemy, a perceptual issue registered on the Marines of the 2nd and 4th Division, Army Infantry, the 27th Infantry Division, and went all the way up the chain of command, all the way to the White House, which I'll demonstrate for you today, based on what happened at Saipan, and it had consequences. And those consequences were unleashed from these very same islands. So in a sense, my colleague was right. The position in the Marianas enabled really the means to force an end to this war. And by the way, only one nation can decide when it will surrender, and that is the surrendering party. Let's bear that in mind as we go forward. So here we have we have the Orange Plan, long envisioned and war-gamed in the 30s in Newport and elsewhere, actually unfolding. The Navy had the benefit of carrying out one of its complex strategic war plans in parallel with MacArthur. And I think that's sort of an amazing thing. You have to game board a lot of possibilities and scenarios, but seldom have we had decades in which to do it and then have those eventualities unfold in front of our very eyes and then have to go carry it out. The people who carried it out, 5th Fleet Commander Raymond Spruance conducts just about all of these operations all the way across the Pacific, alternating with Admiral Halsey. 5th Fleet Commander Spruance, his subordinate Kelly Turner in command of 5th Fib. And at right, who's this guy? Paul Tibbets. You might say, well, where's Curtis LeMay? Well, Tibbets is the one who ends the war. It'll be my thesis that not only was the first atomic bomb necessary and appropriate, but the second one was necessary as well. At no time prior to the Nagasaki bombing did Japan ever seriously entertain surrender, and we'll get into that a bit as well. So the book encompasses quite a bit. It covers not only air, land, and sea operations for the seizure of the Marianas, but it gets into the strategic air operations that unfold as a result of that. It also follows Spruance's path to Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and all the way into the occupation of post-surrender Japan. Spruance is the one who carries the flag in the end days of 1945 as SINCPAC, and it's his staff that writes the report on the final operations of the war. So Spruance, although he doesn't get his 5th star, I believe does deserve to stand with his reputation intact as the most effective operational commander the Navy had in World War II. The fleet at flood tide is embodied in this chart. It's an eye chart. If you're standing in the back, I apologize. But it shows naval production by type for the years 1942, 1943, and 1944. The carriers and battleships, the numbers are significant. Notably in 1943, the aircraft carrier naval aviation comes into its own then. 15 fast carriers are launched in 1943, commissioned from the Independence class to the Essex class, and enables a revolution which bears fruit in the Marianas in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But the real flood tide you'll see represented at lower right. These humble landing craft. We have an LST depicted here, but this class of ships includes the small ones, all the way down to the LCVPs, LCIs, so forth, Amtraks. And the numbers are staggering. 9,400 in 1942, 21,500 in 1943, and 1944, the year we're focused on in the book, 37,700 plus small craft being given to the command of the amphibious forces, Kelly Turner, for the purpose of carrying Marines across the ocean to conquest hardened, fortified enemy objectives. This is Kelly Turner called it heavy power as being this revolution in the fleet that enabled long-range, well-sustained amphibious operations. And so this is the phenomenon that manifests itself in the Marianas in the form of these 3 successive invasions undertaken in the space of 1 month. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. So on June 15th, 1944, 9 days after the Normandy landings, we have landings taking place on the southwest coast of Saipan. There was a fringing reef that required large-scale employment of underwater demolition teams. Draper Kaufman, it was really Turner's brainchild to bring in Draper Kaufman, take him and his Navy Cross winning self, the famous bombsmith who worked during the London Blitz. His father was Com Des Krupak, Reggie Kaufman, so he was well connected, but he was also very capable. and very much the entrepreneur and the evangelist within the fleet for this new discipline of underwater demolition. Those boys go to work on the west coast off of Charon Canoa in the green, red, yellow, and blue beaches, and the 2nd Marine and the 4th Marine Divisions come in behind them with the 27th ID in reserve. And Saipan is important, really, up until this point, we've not yet reckoned with an island of this size. In the Marshall's campaign, you know, these little curly cues of coral, Majuro, Kwajalein, Eniwetok were taken with relatively light casualties. I think Kwajalein was defended by 8,000, garrison of 8,000 Japanese. Most of them were far less, and so regiments could do the honors in many cases. At Saipan, we're going ashore with multiple divisions outnumbered. We're going ashore on an island with 46.5 square miles with a central peak. Mount Tapachau is 1,500 feet high. This limestone plateau, limestone and coral and basaltic lava offered innumerable hidden positions for Japanese mortarmen and artillery. And the garrison of 30,000 men, although very poorly equipped and supplied, represented quite an objective to overcome. And so the honors are carried out initially by the UDT and Turner's tractor navy, and it quickly becomes a land fight in terrain that represents other tropical type terrain we'd face in the 60s, I suppose. You can get a sense of what Saipan looks like from the infantryman's point of view. Horrendous conditions, very difficult to maintain your lines. You're subject to infiltration, not only active infiltration in gaps, but you've got caves that you might miss, caves which would contain enemy soldiers. And for the first time, there's some urban fighting as well in the Garapan. You get a sense of what naval bombardment will do to a town here. The whole place is smashed from the air and burning. But what Saipan represents also, for the first time, we're facing Japanese civilians on a battlefield. And this will have monumental consequences when you realize how the common Japanese citizenry conducts themselves on a battlefield. We had some suppositions about how that would unfold, and they were thrown on their head in the month-long campaign for Saipan. So the fight ashore is 3 days underway when the Japanese combined fleet sorties. Admiral Junichio Zawa takes the entirety of the combined fleet and its remaining aircraft carrier strength to dislodge this American foothold in the Japan's national defense zone. It precipitates the largest carrier battle of the war, Philippine Sea, 3 times the number of flat tops that were involved at Midway. Get after it on June 19th and 20th, 44. The divide in the fleet between the brown shoe and the black shoe comes into focus. I'm sure you're well familiar with the story. Spruance and his legacy as a battleship man, accepting tactical control at Midway from Frank Jack Fletcher, finishing off the Battle of Midway. He's got that to his credit, much to the chagrin of the aviators in the fleet, or I should say the air admirals, especially John Towers. And so Spruance conducts the Battle of the Philippine Sea very differently from the way Misher and the chiefs of Task Force 58 wanted it handled. He holds the fleet close to the islands and is forced to win in defense. And thanks to radar and tactical radios and fighter direction center installation of fighter direction technology on board flagships, it's a smashing victory, 380 claimed air-to-air kills by the F-6F pilots of the combat air patrols. Here's a nice shot from that's the Lexington Top Hatters. Hornet? No. Who are the Top Hatters? I can't remember now. 14. And the Turkeys went out and had their way with the retreating Japanese fleet on the 20th, precipitating the so-called turn on the lights incident, where the late day spotting forces a kind of a wrenching decision on the part of Mark Mitcher whether or not to launch a long-range strike in the waning hours of daylight. He does it. They locate their targets. They put down another Japanese carrier. 2 had been sunk on the 19th by submarines, but the aviators claim the Hio. You'll see Zuikaku, the last carrier from the Pearl Harbor, Kido Butai, taking a shellacking here. She survives the battle and returns. But after Philippine Sea, the Japanese carrier navy is reduced to a husk of its former self. It simply has no aviators left. And so the smashing victory is won the Spruance way. He keeps a leash on the fast carriers, holds them close to the island, recognizing that his mission is strategic in nature. It's the successful completion of Operation Forager. His mission is to support his colleague Kelly Turner and to give them the cover and support they need. So he holds on to his carriers, keeps them close, and wins in defense. And it goes down as a smashing victory. Of course, the air admirals were never terribly happy with that result. They always felt like they could have done more. The revelation of Saipan, I mentioned civilians. We have a internment camp outside of Kanoa here where we took in who was willing to come in. The problem at Saipan was they weren't all willing to come in. The Japanese civilians were subject to determined brainwashing by the Japanese army for years. The entire citizenry was hearing about the barbaric Americans, how they would not only kill prisoners, but they would rape the women and eat the children. The myth spread among the Japanese populace that American Marines, in order to have their enlistments accepted, had to prove their mettle by killing their mothers. And so this was the mythology that struck terror into the hearts of Japanese civilians. So when confronted with advancing Marines, they did terrible things. They retreated to the northern end of Saipan. Marpy Point is shown here. A little bit of 2013 drone photography. These 200-foot cliffs became the site of a self-inflicted atrocity by the Japanese. They flung themselves off the cliff. They threw their children. In some cases, they retreated to caves, huddled in groups, and popped grenades. These atrocities were witnessed at the front by Marine riflemen. They went back to company and battalion headquarters and were absorbed in multiple to the point that there was no denying what was taking place on this island. This is, by the way, all this is unfolding after the final banzai attack of Saipan on the night of July 9th, 7th and 8th. And it was not a revelation that Japanese soldiers would conduct themselves in this battle, but the conduct of the civilians makes an impact. At the end of July, Admiral Nimitz, Admiral King, Major General Smith, Howland Mad Smith, and Spruance take an armed reconnaissance tour of the island with a Marine patrol and see for themselves how the Japanese have fought. This is a case study. It's the first case study they came to see of what landings in Japan might be like. Again, first time anywhere in the Central Pacific that we've seen civilians in the battlefield. It went down as it did, and it carried a lesson with it. Years later, MacArthur's planners would arrive at a term for the ratio by which they estimated casualties from Operation Olympic, the landings in Kyushu, and Coronet, the landings in Honshu. They referred to the Saipan ratio. And after Okinawa, it was revised again. It was basically, we'll sustain 1 American KIA for every 7, and several wounded for every 7 Japanese in the garrison. This was later revised to 1 to 2. And as the intelligence estimates of what the Japanese had in the home islands increased, the collective response was, holy shit, can we afford this? Might we even be thrown into the sea? They started getting a better count of Japanese divisions in place around the home islands, the number of aircraft that had been squirreled away for use as kamikazes, and the interest in what was happening in the New Mexico desert began to acquire increasing importance. So in July, so after this tour of Saipan, King returns to San Francisco, Nimitz goes back to Hawaii. July 25th, 26th, President Roosevelt visits Honolulu to sit down with Nimitz and MacArthur to settle on the path we're going to take across the Pacific. And of course, MacArthur wins the day for his part to keep the Southwestern Pacific Drive going. And Nimitz, having the support of Army air power, continues with his South Pacific Drive, with the Central Pacific Drive. Army air power's ambition lines up behind the Navy's Orange Plan for the seizure of the Marianas. Hap Arnold wants B-29s in the Marianas. It's not working to fly them out of China. Chinese bases are difficult to supply. They're vulnerable to ground attack. We have to have the Marianas. So anyway, it's at this meeting, July of 44 in Honolulu, where MacArthur, Nimitz, and President Roosevelt meet. And afterwards, FDR writes MacArthur, August 9th, you've been doing a really magnificent job against what were great difficulties given us by climate and by certain human animals. Now, where does red language like that come from? It's out of character almost for this idealistic Democrat who thought it should never be necessary to target civilian populations in war, that civilian casualties are to be avoided at all costs. For him to arrive at this cruel judgment came from somewhere. Well, it's my thesis that it came from Saipan, because in Honolulu, President Roosevelt heard directly from Chester Nimitz about how Saipan had gone. The next month, in August, the combined chiefs of staff meet in Quebec City at the beautiful Hotel Frontenac. Churchill's there with his chiefs along with Roosevelt and his chiefs. Stalin will be CC'd on the proceedings. And in the press communique that was issued on September 16th, you see this usually a rather staid and formal form of rhetoric in this official communique. In a very short space of time, they reached decisions on all points with regard to the completion of the war in Europe, now approaching its final stages, and the destruction of the barbarians of the Pacific. Well, where did this rhetoric come from? It's my thesis. Ernie King was at Quebec City. He'd just come from Saipan, and they had plenty of time to chew over the nature of the fighting and the dark turn that it takes once we enter the national defense zone of Imperial Japan. So this goes back to the point of why the Marianas campaign was fateful. It was fateful for this revelation that sinks in upon us about the nature of Japanese civilians and what they will do on a battlefield. And it's fateful for the strategic position it puts us in to transform these three islands into strategic air bases. This work by Army aviation engineers and Navy Seabees is underway under sniper fire, under air attack, and proceeds day and night until on all three islands we have 8,500-foot-long airstrips capable of fielding B-29 Superforts, and Paul Tibbets and his boys will be on the way. Of course, the 21st Bomber Command gets there first. The first strikes against Japan are launched from Saipan on Thanksgiving Day of 1944. As I say, still under sniper fire. We're mopping up at that point. You know, the islands were secure, in air quotes, by the end of August. And so here come Curtis LeMay's boys, unleashing, at first, a failed attempt to undertake high-level precision bombing operations over Japan. The winds over the home islands could approach 100 miles an hour, and it was hopeless to drop bombs from 20, 30,000 feet with any accuracy. So LeMay resorts to low-altitude flying with incendiaries. You can still find these training films on YouTube if you go online and punch in the search terms. You'll find a training film in the employment of the M69 incendiary device. Those are little 6-pound bomblets that are delivered in clusters like this that burst maybe 1,000 feet in the air and rain down gently like heavy snow, hit the ground, and they go spurt, and up goes the devilish concoction of phosphorus and napalm, and it sets everything around it irretrievably on fire. We unleashed this hell on about 3 dozen Japanese cities from the Marianas. This is Nagoya. Can't remember the date, but it's early 1945. The strike on Tokyo, March 10th, 1945, takes 100,000 civilian lives. And what was notable is that there was no measurable change in Japanese civilian morale. They were committed to their war effort. They were loyal in the extreme to their divine God Emperor Hirohito. And from the magic and ultra intercepts, we could register, whether or not the Japanese government was ever serious about, undertaking serious surrender negotiations or anything else. With the fall of the Marianas, the Tojo government comes down, but he's replaced by a rather feckless Prime Minister, Suzuki, who is unable to manage a fateful deadlock of opinion on the Japanese Supreme War Direction Council. Shown here is General Korochika Anami, the Japanese War Minister, counterpart to Stimson. He's a member of a 6-member Supreme War Direction Council, so-called Big Six. They're irretrievably deadlocked about whether or not Japan should surrender. People say Japan was ready to surrender. The revisionists will tell us that Japan was ready to surrender. The first question you have to ask when you hear this is, who is Japan? You can find any number of responsible commanders who knew that the jig was up, that America was steamrolling the imperial forces from Western New Guinea to Okinawa. But even as Okinawa is rolling along in April and May of 1945, you hear guys like this saying one thing: we're this close to our decisive battle, enemy willpower is almost broken. With the reinforcements and redoubling of our effort, we can break their morale. Okinawa falls, and then the talk turns to, well, if we can just get the Americans into our home islands, we'll win our glorious decisive battle on our own territory, and the Americans will come begging, suing for peace. 3-3, this deadlock persists. Elaborate efforts were undertaken to use propaganda to convince the Japanese, to give them a way to surrender that, allowed them to hang up their sword with their dignity intact. There's a culture portrait that I try to paint of the Japanese plight. On Saipan, there was a company commander, Japanese company commander, Captain Sakai Oba, who finds his own way through and around this impossible position he's in. On one hand, expecting to fight like a soldier, and the other expected to give his own life in the final banzai charge. Well, what will he do? Fascinating case study in a man struggling with his own dignity and his own sense of pragmatism as a military man. There's also a Japanese nurse, 18 years old, Shizuko Miura, whose handwritten diary, a translation of her handwritten diary I found in the archives at Hyde Park. She gives us a perspective of the Japanese civilians, the recipients of all this brainwashing. Shizuko does survive to give her own account of this experience, but does at one point pull a grenade, fall against a rock, let go, and then it fizzles in kind of a low-order blast that sends her unconscious, but she goes to the hospital instead. Through all this, through the extensive documentation of the propaganda effort, through the personal accounts of Japanese military and civilians, you get a clear picture of what they needed in order to hang up their weapons and quit. And it was simply to be given the opportunity to do so with their dignity intact. And so these kanji, in this case, this is Hirohito marching his people to their doom. This is an exhortation to rise up against, I think it's the Gaibatsu, the illegitimate Japanese military-industrial complex, and insist on a cessation of hostilities. It doesn't work. Paul Tibbets is called upon to end this war for the Japanese. It is only within the Japanese power to surrender, but they have to be given a means. They have to be given an excuse. They have to be confronted with a new development that is so startling that it will provide Emperor Hirohito the excuse to descend from his divine remove and break this war council by declaration of his will. Such declaration to be a severe break with Japanese traditional practice and culture. Again, he has no voice, and he has no express voice in policy. Hirohito would make his preferences known to his advisors, who would whisper in the ear of the prime minister or to the war council. But this deadlock was going nowhere until Tibbets carries out his project. Paul Tibbets was an extremely effective commander in Europe as a B-17 squadron commander. Few people seem to know this. Do you know how Tibbets got to the Pacific? He was working operating B-17s in Europe. He was in North Africa with the 15th Air Force under his buddy Jimmy Doolittle, knocking the hell out of Axis positions in North Africa along the Mediterranean. He goes into a planning meeting with his wing operations officer, and is informed that he's going to strike the Axis seaport of Bizerte at low altitude, 6,000 feet. It's got German 88s ringing in the harbor. He says, "The hell we're doing this." He says, "But I'll do it if you, Colonel Norstad, come with me as my co-pilot." And he proceeds to upbraid Loris Norstad, the operations officer, and humiliate him in a way that Norstad did not like much. Tibbets discovers how much Norstad liked this when he is summoned to Doolittle's office and informed that Norstad is about to court-martial him. ComGen 15th Air Force tells him there's nothing he can do about it because of Norstad's determination and political connections. And he says, "Oh, but I've got a way out for you." He says, "General Arnold's got a new toy, this B-29. The engines tend to catch on fire a little bit. test pilots are dying by droves, but we think it could use a good man like you. And so Tibbets reports back to Florida. Long story short, he's tapped by 2nd Air Force Commander Uzal Ent to stand up the 509th Composite Group. And so Tibbets becomes the essential man in the secret project undertaken at Wendover, Utah, Army Air Base. And in parallel to the developments at Los Alamos, the development of the bomb, which he is to drop. The little boy device will be known to work. It's a simple gun device, firing one piece of uranium into another, producing a fission reaction. The Fat Man is a much more complex weapon. It's an implosion device depends on a perfectly simultaneous implosion of I think it's 32 charges into a core of plutonium. And we don't know that's going to work. They finally know it works on July 15th, 45, and it's put to use less than a month later. This is the cycle time of this rather high priority operation. The Los Alamos project had a momentum all its own. I looked in vain for a written order from President Truman to use the atomic bombs. The Air Force wrote its own orders. General Spaatz sends it back to Washington for approval and signature. And the Potsdam Conference is underway in Germany when this is all happening. And it actually falls to Secretary of War Stimson after consultation with General Marshall and presumably President Truman. But Truman's memory on this will be hazy. He kind of screwed up the historical record, by the way, by claiming that he issued orders to drop the bomb. In the official Air Force history by Craven and Cates, there's a facsimile of a letter Truman wrote to Cates in 1953 saying, I gave the order to drop the bomb on the way to Potsdam when I was on the cruiser Augusta. And if you check the deck logs of the Augusta, none of the timelines line up. The fact was there was no order from Truman to drop the bomb. Los Alamos had a momentum all its own. General Groves, the military commander at Los Alamos, recalls it being basically a policy by Truman of non-interference. And so Tibbets puts this into effect. The bombs are dropped. Hirohito goes to his War Direction Council and gives a tearful soliloquy about the cruel new bomb and the inhumane nature of the war, and that we must save humanity by ceasing our war effort. I thought the rhetoric all the way through was fascinating. The high-mindedness, the pretense to saving human civilization that Hirohito conferred upon himself, again, goes back to the idea of the Japanese having to have ideals and dignity behind their actions. They can't just lie down and be beaten by a superior power. They had to be given a way out. The bombs were singularly important in this respect. The text of the imperial rescript that Hirohito issues to his people on August 15th, 1945 is specific evidence of this, as are the diaries of any number of Japanese officials who were present for a lot of these conversations. The bomb was singularly important. Soviet entry of the war didn't help, but it was the bombs that were mentioned. It was the bombs that gave Hirohito cover to descend from his remove and approve a cessation of hostilities. So the book carries past the surrender. I'm going to wrap here and just explain a bit that I was happy to stay with the story of Raymond Spruance as occupier, along with Halsey and MacArthur and the rest of this vast invasion force that suddenly was transformed by the surrender into a humanitarian rescue operation. Operation Olympic and Operation Coronet were effected almost simultaneously in late September of 1945 with the occupation of Japan. And what's fascinating is to focus on the experience of the first men in. They were technicians from the 18th Airborne Division. By MacArthur's order, they were to go in and set up radio communications between Kyushu and Okinawa to facilitate the larger movement to follow in a few days. And imagine being these technicians, being flown in your C-54s, landing at Atsugi, which was the largest Japanese kamikaze training base in the empire. What types of people might you expect to find there, and how long would you live to witness it? Of course, they're greeted as conquerors. They're greeted with courtesy and with every bowing and scraping bit of obsequiety you could imagine. And I think they were stunned to discover how complete the Emperor's will, how completely the Emperor's will was enacted by his people and carried forward. Food stores were trucked out and laid at the feet of the conquerors. They said, we're good to go. We've got our rations. This food is for your people. We saw to the good treatment by MacArthur's specific insistence of the Japanese people at every turn. They were to be treated courteously, and they returned that courtesy in turn. Spruance and Halsey are managing not only the occupation, but the exfiltration of POWs. Fascinating to look at the action report of the hospital ship USS Haven at Dejima Pier, Nagasaki, late September 45. Taking out American POWs, checking them out, cleaning them up, and then reckoning for the first time with atomic bomb survivors. I don't think anybody understood the effects of gamma ray on human flesh. The theoreticians understood the release of heat and the shock wave that the atomic bomb would produce, but nobody understood the effects of radiation, proven never more dramatically than by documents I found that showed what plans we had for the future atomic bombs that were coming off the line at Los Alamos. The third one was going to be ready September 21st for use against a Japanese city. Landings were to take place in November. That's right, November, then March. So Kyushu in November. Production of Fat Man type devices at Los Alamos was going to be 3 per month starting in November. And the plans were to use these tactically. So 3 bombs a month for use against Japanese, division headquarters, large troop concentrations, with the plan being to, send in the Marines 3 days later to clean up. Can you imagine what that would have looked like? Can you imagine how ugly and horrifying the war would have been but for the atomic bombs? Not only for our guys, but for the Japanese, but for the poor souls on mainland Asia who are under Japanese occupation, all those countries. It's really hard to argue that there was a more humane way to go. This gets into a realm of Thomas Aquinas and just war theory that I touch on a little bit and point to how it's just kind of word salad. For example, you can have a just war, but only basically it reduces to only if there's goodness in your heart as you're slaughtering millions of people. That's basically just war theory. Any philosophers in the room to disagree? If you have just objectives, the end justifies the means. The doctrine of double effect. Bad effects are excusable so long as something good comes of it. Again, gross oversimplification, but these are the philosophical doctrines of just war that people struggle with to wrap their minds around this horrible necessity, the fact that in the 40s, every nation of the world subscribed to the idea that you could bomb civilians, from the air, slaughter them in mass, and that was just the way of a war-stricken world. It's an incredible human tragedy. I tried to treat it that way in the book, while celebrating the tremendous professionalism of our military forces of all branches. Maybe in the Q&A we can talk about what the Surface Navy did in these campaigns. There's some interesting stuff to talk about there, but I'd like to wrap on that note, I think. And what time we have left, let's talk some more. So thank you. Yeah.
Sure, my name is Doug Robb. Thanks very much for your presentation. My name is Doug because my dad wrote his PhD dissertation on MacArthur. Sorry, I got mine there. But my question is actually on just war theory and the utilitarian calculus of dropping the bomb. I don't think anyone would deny that it was necessary to end the war. But when you talk about war crimes, perfidy, where you emulate the enemy or you dress like a civilian, Enola Gay, as I recall, is painted with a big W on the tail, signifying a weather observing plane. So do you think that the act of Paul Tibbets flying over mainland Japan, just in a plane painted like that, is a war crime?
It's a war crime. Wow, that's a penetrating question. I think it was a Circle R, actually. I never heard the weather plane. There was a weather plane that went with Enola Gay as well as a photography plane. I don't know, boy. I mean, all B-29s kind of look the same. I don't know that it would have been meaningful to paint it red or something, and we could have felt better about ourselves for having painted it red. Certainly on Saipan, the use of civilians as human shields, that's the context in which, you look at a lot of this. A submarine beneath the sea, is that stealthy? Is it a war crime? I don't know. I think there wasn't a fairly practical awareness that that the victor kind of decides who the war criminals are. One of the conditions Japan was insisting upon before they would entertain any talk of surrender, it was not just the retention of the imperial throne, but they had 3 additional conditions, and one of them had to do with war crimes. They said no war crimes except those that we will conduct ourselves, thank you. That was one of the conditions. There was to be no occupation by foreign troops of Japanese soil. And what was the 4th one? There were 4 conditions. Retention of the imperial throne. Anyway, all of these were non-starters under a policy of unconditional surrender, which itself was said to be beyond the bounds of international law. Unconditional surrender. Well, surrender is a negotiated settlement of some kind. You can see the conditions that Admiral Nimitz insisted on. He wanted every Japanese submarine to surface, run lights at night, throw all of their searchlights skyward. Ports were to remove their torpedo netting. All guns were to be spiked, and all batteries and all ships. A lot of preconditions and negotiations and details to work out. Minesweepers thrown to the service of the U.S. Navy. All kinds of things, but that's a penetrating question, and I think they're interesting questions. Is it more humane to kill somebody in a shower of liquid fire than with a fission reaction? Does it matter a bullet in the head at close range? If you shoot someone in the back of the head or the front of the head, does it matter? You can talk about them this way that makes it sound like I'm ridiculing all these distinctions. I think they're not to be ridiculed. I think they're serious, but they're probably also impossible to answer. Because again, there's a certain circularity for me that comes into play. Yeah?
George Washington's been called the indispensable man in the Revolutionary War. Would you consider Nimitz to be in that arena also? And he was almost killed, I think, in an airplane crash in 43 or something like that. Do you think things would have been different if he was?
Yeah, Chester Nimitz, was he the indispensable man of the Pacific War? He didn't feel that way when he got out there. He wrote Catherine as soon as he got to Pearl Harbor. Fascinating, quick little exchange of correspondence gives you a window into his feelings at the start of the war as he's relieving Kimmel and keeping Kimmel's staff intact. That's an important move, by the way, for morale, right? Things will go bad, but we're going to right this ship. The signal he sent, the signal of humility. His humility was very important, but what he says to Catherine, she says, "It's been your dream all along to command the Pacific Fleet. What a glory this will be." And he writes back and he says, "Catherine, no one must know, but the fleet's at the bottom of the sea." And he later says, "I won't last 6 months," in part because of what they're about to do to Kimmel with the inquest and all that. There are very few things you can point to in Nimitz's record and say those were mistakes. I think he approached war with a hyper-realistic sense that if things were going roughly for us, the enemy was also having a share of problems. So let's appreciate that and not lose heart or hope. We're licking our wounds, but by God, you should see them. That was a message he constantly drilled down and spread. His use of intelligence, I think, was very admirable. He was a real, very disciplined consumer of that product and facilitated its production there at his own base at Station Hypo. That's a terrible story, isn't it? How Station Hypo was treated by Op 20G back here after Midway because they were so embarrassed they had to, wage war. The Redmond brothers did, I guess, against Rochefort and his guys. But Nimitz was a supporter of the use of intelligence. He understood the revolution that was represented by submarine warfare, having been a submariner himself. He understood naval aviation. He understood, sometimes you have to make choices like keeping your battleship fleet, Task Force 1, moored to the coast, let the carriers win the war for you. He made hard decisions like that. He was very good with people. One thing that impressed me most in researching my books was his handling of the relief of Admiral Gormley as Comm SOPAC. They were old friends. And the finesse with which Nimitz handled this, I think we have this from Gormley's point of view about their conversation in Honolulu when he hauls Gormley back from Maya, having sent Halsey down there. He said, "Well, as you know, Bob, this is a pretty pivotal theater. The stakes are very high, and as you know, it's essential we have the best man for the job down there, the very best man." And there must have been something in the way Admiral Nimitz spoke those words, the sympathy of his eye contact or his engagement with his old friend. He got Gormley to admit, Nimitz said, "Do you think you're that man?" And Gormley had to say no. So to be able to elicit that kind of admission in an intimate setting, personal setting, with a subordinate who's also an old friend of yours, he was just very good with people. He could manage big egos and keep them focused on missions. And, so the more you read about Nimitz, the more there is to like, I think. So I would agree with your assessment. I would agree with your assessment for a variety of reasons. Yes, sir.
Yeah, they say you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but I have to say that's a pretty attractive cover.
Oh, thank you.
But it makes me think about, at the end of the war, very end of the war, how the Fast Carrier Task Force would concentrate to strike and then recoil and disperse to refuel, replenish, and then reconcentrate again to strike up and down the coast of Japan. Can you talk about that at all, or how that affected the end of the war?
Yeah, so Halsey was famous for the Curry Harbor strike that destroyed the rest of the Japanese Navy at anchor, kind of a symbolic, a mercy killing, if you will, a ceremonial execution, I don't know what you'd call it. Earlier in the war, the carriers, the fleet at flood tide, that chart that showed the 15 carriers coming off the line in 1943, all of a sudden our air admirals have all these toys, so now how are we going to deploy them and use them? And so the discipline of, fighter direction and duty carrier for combat air patrol, while the other carriers are rotate on strike duty. They're able to have kind of an assignment of roles and allocate responsibilities in a way that gave them so much ability to concentrate, four task groups, or disperse. The truck strike's a great example. After a little introduction to Paul Tibbets, I go straight to Operation Hailstone, which is the use of three of our 4 Task Force 58 groups to hit truck. That was necessary to clear the way for the seizure of Eniwetok, which was Spruance's brainstorm as Kwajalein was wrapping up. Eniwetok was a tremendous staging base and would be the base from which the Marianas campaign was staged. This was all improvisation. It was all Spruance nudging Nimitz and saying, hey, why don't we do this? But the strike on truck is a great example of how the carrier Navy, through concentration and the development of that Hellcat fighter pilot corps, acquired this ability not to hit and run any longer. They could hit and stay. And so here they're going after truck. It was Nimitz's long-stated ambition to fly his personal flag over that atoll, and Spruance does something that's really kind of profoundly out of character also, which gets us to the surface Navy role in this campaign. So the truck strike is a 2-day-long foray down to the Caroline Islands, staged out of Majuro. 3 groups, 2 days. They plaster the hell out of a bunch of trawlers and training cruisers and destroyers, the combined fleet having been withdrawn a mere week before out of fear. They've seen the air reconnaissance fly over, and they knew something was coming. But in the midst of these airstrikes at truck, Spruance does something. He hears, word comes back from one of the aviators that Japanese ships are escaping through North Pass. And so it's the Katori, this light cruiser, and a couple destroyers. And so Spruance detaches the USS New Jersey, his flagship. He takes personal command of this squadron. New Jersey, Iowa, New Orleans, Minneapolis, and 4 destroyers, and goes hunting. And he's the fleet commander in tactical command. And Carl Moore's chief of staff says, what? They weren't trained or equipped to do this, but you get the sense that Spruance, as the old captain of the Mississippi, the Black Shoe, couldn't resist this final grasp at history. And so I like that truck set piece for that little flash out of character. It shows you Spruance as a war fighter, the fighter's heart. He had a little bit of Halsey in him, although Spruance would always insist war was an intellectual puzzle to be solved and was very restrained at all times. But no, the marshaling of so much aircraft carrier power in one place in the form of Task Force 58, which, by the way, really should have been called the Grand Fleet. Task Force 58 never did it justice, that name. It's kind of awesome in a way to give it such a humble name, suggesting we had 57 other task forces like it. But they had their way with the Japanese at every point following the summer of '44. Leyte Gulf, the tragedy there is that we might have known the Japanese carriers were toothless, but here, Halsey's trying to correct the excessive conservatism of Spruance at Philippine Sea and decides he's going to go hunt carriers, by God, and leaves Taffy 3 hanging out to dry with terrible results. So it's frustrating to look back and see what could have been done and should have been done. At the end of the day, Halsey is given his 5th star, and I think that, I don't know, from what I've read, I'd always thought that it was the morale value of having Halsey as fleet admiral, that was the driver. He had been on the cover of Time magazine and was a celebrity back home. I think what it really boiled down to was it was an acknowledgement of his time as a theater commander in '42 in the South Pacific when the war could have gone either way. So Halsey, gets his 5th star, but he was positively garrulous and exuberant and everything else went at the opportunity to carry the fight to mainland Japan and can carry out those 1945 strikes, which weren't terribly important. They're really worried about Japanese airfields more than anything else. They're trying to put the airfields out of business, and found out that was really difficult to do. I found a Navy report that broke down the probability of destroying a 25-foot radius anti-aircraft gun emplacement, or revetment, with a dive bombing strike. And I think any given dive bomber ended up having about a 20,000 to 1 chance of hitting a 25-foot target with a manually dropped dive bomb. No, it was 300 to 1. I'm sorry, it was about 300 to 1 in a 70-degree dive. Glide bombing, it went to like 1,000, and then level bombing, it was like 20,000 to 1. But it really kind of shows the futility of taking out airfields and how the Japanese were going to, right up to the end, they would have had the ability to launch kamikaze aircraft in our invasion fleet. And they had 10,000 planes dedicated to that task. So, I guess I must have answered your question in there somewhere. Do we have time? Yes.
This is fascinating to me. Like many people, my father was in World War II. When he passed, I got his notebook, which had his sum total of his experience. And in that notebook was an article on the invasion that never happened, and a graphic of it. And he had pinpointed where his destroyer was going to be stationed. And the only comment that he provided to me, because they didn't talk much, our World War II veterans, at least my father did, was that everyone in the wardroom had taken the time to either write or rewrite their will. I was wondering if through the course of your research you could really, you could get the mood of the soldier or the sailor on the deck plates as they were facing that final push.
Yeah, very much so. I got that. Certainly there's that moment of relief of, every UDT team we had in commission was at Oceanside, California, getting ready to go over there, and for the landings. And when and George Kistiakowski was over there too. He was Draper Kaufman's bombsmith. He was a professor of chemistry at Harvard who got roped into working with the UDT on some explosive technology, and then he gets called to Los Alamos. Kistiakowski's the guy who figures out how to have a simultaneous implosion on a plutonium core that enables a fat man. So he's kind of an interesting guy. But when Kistiakowski gets the news, he's with all these UDT guys in Oceanside, and he takes every explosive charge he owns and goes into a field and sets them off in celebration. And everybody had that sense of life renewed and extension given. When they got to, when the occupiers got into Kyushu, they saw those roads and these narrow roads that could not possibly have supported the logistical train of four whole armies going into the home islands, and had that same feeling. Oh my! Thank God we didn't have to do this. The cave loads of suicide planes and Kai-10, suicide boats, and every other horror that the Bamboo Lancers Brigade had waiting for us. It's widespread. It's almost in every oral history I've ever seen. The moment of realization the war is over, the euphoria, the thanking of the Creator, that we had the means to end it at a blow. It was so dramatic.
You see a different attitude between the end of the war in the Pacific versus the end of the war in Europe?
Well, is there a difference between the end of the war in Europe and the end of the war in the Pacific? I haven't studied Europe closely enough, but I have seen the order of battle for Operation Olympic and Coronet. It involved the entire 8th Air Force. It involved every Army division that was on the continent, packing up, going around the world and staging in the Philippines or the Marianas to hit Japan. So those guys couldn't have felt too good. I think you see this in Band of Brothers. You know, these guys know they're Pacific bound in May of '45. It's all of a piece. You know, the war effort in one theater winds down, the other one is ramping up to this crescendo. The firebombing of Japan's underway, the planning for Kyushu, for Olympic. And so, no, those guys didn't think it was over by any means. Japan was fundamentally different in that it was over. The Axis was done. The Axis was done. Is that it? Well, thank you so much. This was really a great deal of fun for me.